On April 2nd, 2025, Trump set tariffs on every country on Earth using a nonsensical formula as a justification, proclaiming it as Liberation Day. This immediately set into motion an economic catastrophe. Though nearly every tariff was reversed within weeks, he could reinstate them any moment. His cult followers have praised Trump for his brilliant statesmanship, but every school of economics has long condemned blanket tariffs as one of the most atrocious policies a capitalist economy can make. The cultists now consider economic departments, a lone bulwark of political conservatism in academia, to be anti-American traitors. Tariffs are an economic instrument by governments to collect revenue, by imposing fees on companies for imported goods. All arguments for Trump's Liberation Day tariffs are terrible and exemplify the willful stupidity of the MAGA cult. A trade deficit simply means that the U.S. imports more than it exports. The U.S. has a trade deficit with many countries, most notably with China, where it has a trade deficit of $263 billion. This has been the primary motivating factor for the Trump tariffs and has been a rallying cry of MAGA for years. The chief reason is that trade deficits are supposedly theft. In fact, this may be one of the few things Trump has ever believed in, even taking out a full-page ad all the way back in 1987 complaining about them. In those days, the main enemy was Japan.
We're losing the United States is losing $200 billion a year. $200 billion we're losing in this country. As simple as that. If this were a company, they would have filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceedings years ago. This country is losing so much money that there's a question as to how much longer it can continue.
So the $200 billion, you're really talking about trade deficits?
We're talking about huge trade deficits. And you can't continue to run a company or a country and lose $200 billion a year. And that's what we're doing. And it's going to go up.
He has complained about the trade deficit many times before his first presidency, and it has only escalated since.
It's the greatest theft in the history of the world, what they've done to the United States. They've taken our jobs,
from us, why is it okay to do business with them?
Well, we can do, but we're going to turn it around. We're going to end up making money from them. We're losing in terms of balance of payments, in terms of anything you want to do with trade. We're losing almost $400 billion a year with China. Nobody can turn that.
We have a $500 billion deficit, trade deficit with China. We're going to turn it around, and we have the cards. Don't forget, we're like the piggy bank that's being robbed. We have the cards. We have a lot of power with China. When China doesn't want to fix the problem in North Korea, we say, sorry, folks, you got to fix the problem. Because we can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
Trade between China and the United States has not been, over the last many years, a very fair one for us. As we all know, America has a huge annual trade deficit with China, a number beyond anything what anybody would understand. This number is shockingly hundreds of billions of dollars each year. Estimates are as high as $500 billion a year. We must immediately address the unfair trade practices that drive this deficit, along with barriers to market success.
And on and on and on. There is no evidence that trade deficits are theft. Imagine one guy grows apples and another grows oranges. They each have $100 and 50 fruits to sell at $1 each. The apple guy buys 30 oranges for $30. The orange guy buys 20 apples for $20. Now the apple guy imported more than he exported, so technically he has a $10 trade deficit. The orange guy has a $10 trade surplus. But neither was tricked. They both made the trades they wanted. The apple guy got more oranges because he wanted them more than he wanted to keep all his cash. The orange guy was fine with fewer apples. When it's over, both still have the same total value in cash and fruit, just arranged differently in a way that makes them happier. No one was robbed. Calling the apples guy's trade deficit theft is just stupid. If we apply the MAGA cult's fifth-grade logic in the other direction, we could say that those with a trade surplus are being ripped off. Since many goods imported from countries like China are owned by individuals on a long-term basis, therefore giving countries with a trade deficit a far greater cumulative wealth. Another analogy to show the absurdity of it is your trade deficit with the local grocery store. That's right, every month your money is being stolen by Walmart or the local butcher. You give them money for goods, but do they ever buy anything from you? No? I guess we need to tax these businesses until they buy as many things from you as you do from them. The only retort is that obviously your local grocery store is different from national economies. Of course it is. But it also isn't an argument that trade deficits are theft. Vaguely gesturing that your personal problems or America's economic problems are caused by trade deficits isn't an argument either. It's just a sign that you're in a cult and have forfeited any ability to think. In fact, the absurdity of the claim that trade deficits are theft was spelled out centuries ago by the god of capitalism himself, Adam Smith. In every country it always is and must be the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest. The proposition is so very manifest that it seems ridiculous to take any pains to prove it, nor could it ever have been called in question had not the interested sophistry of merchants and manufacturers confounded the common sense of mankind. Hence, in Great Britain and in most other European countries, the extraordinary duties upon almost all goods imported by alien merchants. There is not even evidence that tariffs will alleviate the trade deficit long term. The reason is that tariffs make the dollar stronger, which makes it more expensive for countries to import from the U.S., which either cancels out any reduction of the deficit or actively increases it. The real kicker is that the United States makes back most of the trade deficit each year in foreign investment. Because U.S. purchases of foreign goods are denominated in U.S. dollars, the global reserve currency, much of the money ends up in America's coffers anyway. Reducing the trade deficit through tariffs entails less foreign investments, meaning the true balance of payments hasn't improved at all, hurting the economy for no reason. This totally nullifies Trump's entire basis for the tariffs, but according to his cult followers, he's playing 4D chess. This will bring back manufacturing. Manufacturing is the new buzzword in politics, and politicians and constituents from across the political spectrum decry its decline. But tariffs will bring manufacturing back. Jesus Christ, Trump said so. Actually, the whole premise of the claim is inaccurate. Look at this graph. Pause the video and take as many hours as you need to digest this. Here's the graph excluding new industries such as electronics. Even with this data set, industrial production has kept pace with population growth. Again, take as many hours as you need to digest this. The decline of manufacturing is an illusion, caused by automation in the factories and the sheer volume of goods imported from abroad. It does not necessarily come at the expense of American industry, but are just additional goods Americans can consume. Sure, far more textile factories and low-capital factory labor exist in other countries, like in Southeast Asia, than in the United States. So what? Americans don't even want to work the jobs we have now. This isn't new information, and it has been brought to Trump's attention by his own staff, and his response is very revealing of his thought process. From Fear by Bob Woodward, pages 123 to 124. The MAGA cult views knowing facts as sinful, and everything is subservient to the aesthetic, which in this case is Soviet realism. Buckle up, folks. We're in the era of MAGA Maoism. If factories were built in America, they would be built from the bottom up to be as automated as possible, to avoid a labor shortage and remain profitable long term. Even as total manufacturing output, excluding electronics, has stagnated, total share of employment has precipitously declined, something only possible through higher productivity. Will tariffs nonetheless boost domestic manufacturing? In fact, the evidence leans against this. We'll just get rid of the income tax. Bad idea. First, some Economics 101. Economic equilibrium can roughly be described as the state in a market economy where economic forces such as supply and demand are balanced. The equilibrium is modeled in the famous supply and demand graph. There are many things which distort this equilibrium. One of these is called deadweight loss. When taxes are collected by the government, the money is not generally destroyed or locked away, but is reinvested in society. For example, the taxes collected for Social Security are dispersed to Social Security recipients, who subsequently circulate the money in the economy. This goes for virtually everything in the economy. Even money exchanged in the black market definitionally ends up in the formal market, one way or the other. So, what's the problem? The problem is the deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is defined in Economics for Dummies as the amount by which the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus is reduced whenever output is less than the socially optimal output level. It's basically a way of modeling opportunity cost, which has a real economic cost. In the supply and demand graph, the deadweight loss is modeled by the Harburger triangle. Since the deadweight loss isn't reinvested in the economy, it simply vanishes. As a reminder, tariffs are a type of tax, and the deadweight loss is larger than for income tax. Conservatives like to argue that because the U.S. government financed itself through tariffs in the past, that therefore we can get rid of income tax. They never bother to argue why this is actually better. In fact, the average deadweight loss of tariffs until the income tax was introduced was almost 50%. This means that for every dollar in revenue collected by the government, 50 cents vanishes from the economy. A similar estimate was given for Trump's tariffs in his first term. After retaliation, the deadweight loss increases to a staggering 270%. Meanwhile, all estimates for the average deadweight loss from income tax are significantly lower, with the average being around 26.4%, as estimated in a landmark paper published in 1982. For many reasons, tariffs are worse than income tax on a dollar-per-dollar basis in every study. But this assumes all other things are equal. They aren't. In fact, it is literally impossible for tariffs to finance just the U.S. military budget alone. The maximum tariff that the United States can place against all nations before tariff revenue actually decreases is 50%, which provides a revenue of $778 billion to the government. This is because the import costs become so prohibitive that there's a significantly lower volume of trade. Therefore, there's less trade to tax. There quickly reaches a point where no revenue is collected from tariffs. Meanwhile, the total income tax collected in 2024 was $2.4 trillion. Go ahead, research it yourself. The more in-depth you go, the worse it looks for tariffs. They're ripping us off. Again, there is no evidence that trade deficits are theft. One statistic conservatives like to bring up is that other countries had larger tariffs on the U.S. than vice versa. Reminder, tariffs are paid by the importer. So fundamentally, when one nation tariffs another nation, they are placing a tax on themselves. They don't normally place the tariff to rip off the other nation. They place the tariff to rip off their own citizens. That doesn't mean the tariff won't have an effect on exporting nations. Less trade hurts everyone, and it can seriously harm the other country. For example, the tiny country of Lesotho's second largest trading partner is the United States. They exported about $236 million worth of goods to the U.S. in 2022 and imported about $7 million. Lesotho has a GDP of $2 billion and a GDP per capita of $916. On April 2nd, Trump levied 50% on them since Lesotho is ripping off the U.S. An impoverished country like Lesotho does not have the wealth to purchase so much U.S. goods that the trade deficit reverses, which was Trump's condition for removing the tariffs. Since Lesotho's exports to the U.S. were worth 1/8 of their GDP, this will greatly harm their country. The MAGA cultists consider this a brilliant victory. Nonetheless, Lesotho citizens want to eat, and their exports will find a new market. Generally, tariffs harm the country that levies them the most. Ignoring all this and assuming that tariffs are paid by the exporting nation, the MAGA cultists argue that the tariffs levied on the U.S. justified a global trade war on a scale not seen since the Smoot-Hawley Act. Here was the state of affairs in 2022. The percent refers to the average tariff rate. The United States had a 3.3% average tariff. As you see, our number one trading partner, as it has long been, is Canada. Take note that their tariff rate was only 0.5% higher than ours. The MAGA cultists have directed a large amount of hatred against Canada and have used the ripping us off in trade bit to justify their homicidal rhetoric. This is a widely shared chart on social media. The percentages for agricultural products come from the over-access commitment lines in this document. What does over-access commitment mean? Above the access commitment or tariff rate quota, a much higher level of tariffs is applied to a product. However, for all of these products, not a single one of them actually reaches the higher tariff level. Most of the import volume is significantly below the access limit and thus is taxed at a significantly lower rate, usually about 7.5%. Some of the trade of these products, however, is suspiciously close to the access limit. This is because a specific permit is needed to trade above the TRQ, and vendors are unwilling to take out a permit that taxes so high. So it can be argued that these high tariffs deter trade, and thus are enacted in effect. However, this would only apply to 5 products: chicken, eggs and egg products, butter and cream powders, cheeses and cream. What the chart posters fail to mention is that the U.S. also had significant tariffs for certain products imported from Canada. The second talking point is fentanyl use. During 2024, 43 pounds or 19.5 kilograms of fentanyl was seized coming into the U.S. from Canada. Donald Trump used this statistic as the casus belli for his trade war. Drugs crossing borders is, of course, bad. What can Canada do to address this? Maybe it should create drug task forces and strengthen their border. Oh wait, they already did that, but Trump levied 25% tariffs on them anyway. According to a regional director of the Canadian Border Services Agency, 1% of fentanyl in Canada ends up in the U.S. The data Trump used to justify the trade war also conveniently left out that only 2 pounds, or 0.9 kilograms, was seized the year before. These are far fewer so-called lethal doses than the numbers the White House used. Between 2022 and 2024, 59 pounds of fentanyl was seized at the northern border. Meanwhile, 61,900 pounds was seized at the southern border, meaning fentanyl from Canada makes up roughly 0.1% of all seizures. There is no evidence that Canada is deliberately allowing narcotics into the U.S. On the contrary, they are making good faith efforts to increase border security. Despite that, Trump implemented a 25% tariff on Canada on February 1st, and there is no recourse for Canada. Obviously, expecting the Canadian government to be omniscient and omnipotent is stupid. If Canada seized 19.5 kilograms of fentanyl coming from the United States and decided that a 25% tariff on the U.S. and a trade war was the solution, the MAGA cultists would immediately be calling for a nuclear holocaust. More evidence of the nihilism of conservatives is the fact that the United States has a trade surplus with many countries, and yet a blanket tariff was levied on them as well. In 2023, the U.S. trade surplus with Australia was $32 billion. They still endured the baseline 10% tariff from Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. Australia was playing by the stupid rules conservatives demanded, and these reciprocal tariffs were supposedly about justice. By their logic, this 10% tariff must be an injustice, and Australia is justified in starting a trade war with the U.S. It is likely some countries are ripping off the United States in certain ways. For example, China is guilty of major technology theft from the U.S. This could call for targeted tariffs or something else to deter this. But we are long past that. Reverberating disasters. There really is just nothing redeemable about blanket tariffs. The reality is that the poor will suffer the most. This has been demonstrated time and time again in many analyses. Virtually all economists believe tariffs are bad. The terrible effects of tariffs are well documented. There isn't some anti-MAGA conspiracy going back decades in economics departments. Trump is just wrong and you're in a cult.
What do you make of the present President of the United States and his tariffs?
It's painful to see what a ruinous decision from back in the 1920s being repeated. If you set off a worldwide trade war, that has a devastating history.